Go. Okay, we are recording. Ladies and gents, again, my apologies. I should have warned you. This session will be recorded. If you would like to, let me pause that for a second. And again, thank you for joining us today at JALT International 2020. Please welcome Chris Jones, who is going to present on dramatized literature and speech awareness. I would appreciate maybe a wonderful, yes, exactly, a wonderful round of applause, if you don't mind, just to start him off. Thank you so much. If you would unmute and give him a round of applause. Thank you so much. All right, Chris, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Right. Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, Kinsella. I appreciate that. And thanks for the help with the presentation. Thanks also to Tara McElroy and the Literature and Language SIG for inviting me to this talk. This is fairly brief, about a 20-minute talk with about 5 minutes for questions at the end. Obviously, I've put my email in the chat, so if you want a copy of the slides, then feel free to email me, and I'll also make them available to the Literature and Language SIG. Okay, this is what I'm going to talk about. Very briefly, some features, models, and issues of spoken language. And when I use the term spoken language, I'm talking very much particularly about conversational language here. Some findings from a recent study that I undertook with a colleague of mine, and some brief implications for teaching. Okay, so we know that spoken language, and particularly conversational language, has lots of typical discourse features and linguistic features, which are often different or at least differ to written language. So some common discourse features are that turns in speech are co-constructed very often. Speakers finish turns for each other, help each other to develop their own turn, etc. There's lots of overlap in talk, particularly again in conversational talk. And there's a lot of repetition, particularly of nouns and noun phrases. But generally there's a lot of repetition, the kind of repetition which isn't tolerated as much in written forms. Of course, these are not the only discourse features, but these are some common ones. In terms of language, we know that features such as ellipsis are very, very frequent. So instead of informally, instead of people saying, do you want a coffee or would you like a coffee, they might just say want a coffee, or they might even just say coffee. There's lots of spoken discourse markers such as well, anyway, so, etc. There are many discourse markers, of course. And there's lots of vagueness and vague language expressions such as sort of, that kind of thing. Okay, so we know that it's different. The problem is, how do we go about teaching this to students? What kind of models can we present to them? If we use dialogues taken straight from a corpus, a spoken corpus, and there are many available now, if they're unedited, they can be demotivating for learners. They're quite removed from their experience, and that can be an issue. Recordings don't always exist, so we might have to make them. They can also be quite hard to follow for most learners. Again, it's a recording of a conversation which is between people far removed from them. It's by its nature relatively messy, and it can be hard to follow. One solution, and this is a solution I would support, is to use corpus-informed dialogue. So to take data from a corpus, a spoken corpus, and to edit it slightly and to use it to inform your dialogue and make it more accessible, motivating, easier to follow, etc. for students. And McCarthy McCarten and Sandiford, sorry, have produced material of that nature. So that's one solution. I'm going to talk about another one today, which is to use dialogues from literature. Why might we want to do this? Well, there's a lot of evidence that literature can be engaging, motivating. It can encourage students to think in English. And I think with spoken language, particularly if it's dramatized, it can have all of those kind of aspects to it. Also, of course, dramatized literature is not the same as conversation. It's not identical, it's scripted, but there are a lot of spoken language features which are present in scripted dialogues, and there's evidence for this, in some of the research below. So while it's not identical, it is. There are a lot of similarities, and it has the advantage of perhaps being potentially more engaging, motivating, and accessible for learners. In terms of the research, though, when we looked at this, we found that there were gaps, and there's very few studies on ellipsis and people's use of ellipsis or development of ellipsis in the instructed second language acquisition field. There's lots and lots of studies which look at how learners or speakers of English use ellipsis, often in comparison to native speaker models. But there isn't much on how that might develop via some form of instruction at all. So that's a gap. And there's very, very little related to literature as a model of spoken language, really. There are lots of papers suggesting that literature could be a useful model of spoken language, but there's very little which has tested that out, as it were, in the field. So the study I'm going to talk about is one that we did, which was to try to, in some way, fill in this gap a little bit. And this was something I published with my colleague Jane Cleary in 2019. I'll put the references at the end. So we designed a study with 3 groups to try to test this out. And we had different groups. The first group was an experimental group 1. They were given explicit teaching and textual input enhancement. I'll say a bit more about the type of teaching in a moment. Textual input enhancement here was just that the features that we looked at were highlighted for them in the text in bold. Explicit teaching here was meant as students were made aware of what the aims of the class were. It wasn't that we were standing at the board and repeating rules about grammar to them. So it was very much inductive teaching, but it was explicit in that sense. The experimental 2 group were explicit only, so there was no textual input enhancement, and then there was a control who had no teaching but did the tests. There was pre-test, post-test, and delayed. Post-test, the delay was after 3 weeks. 2 types of pre-tests and post-test and delayed tests. One was on just comprehension. One was on a receptive test for ellipsis. And we did those with all of the 3 groups, obviously. We also used 2 focus groups from the experimental 1 and experimental 2 after the instruction and after the delay test to try to get a handle on what they felt about the material and what they felt about the language that they'd come across, etc. The teaching, we took a text-based approach that's been described by Timmis in 2018. A text-based approach means that you first of all look for texts, in this case obviously dramatized literary text, which you think are going to be interesting, engaging, etc. for students, and then you go back and think about the language that might be contained in them. You don't go looking for texts which have examples of language point A or language point B or language point C. Okay, so we did that first. We then came out with 3 hours of instruction on actually different aspects of spoken language, which was contained in the dramatized literature that we used, which was the BBC show Sherlock. And we found different aspects of spoken language there. We focused on ellipsis and also modality and also spoken request forms, but we only tested ellipsis. We use Timmis's framework as well for spoken grammar, which is kind of similar to the idea that I mentioned yesterday in my other talk. But anyway, we had kind of lead-in and engagement tasks. We had global understanding tasks of the bits of Sherlock, if you like. We had noticing tasks where they were focused in on the language being used, and we had discussion tasks. There was no attempt to get students to produce language with ellipsis. We didn't think it was appropriate for this type of language, and that was not the aim here. We were just looking at their receptive ability. Okay, participants were all B2 level. That was measured on standardized tests. There was 51 students. They were divided equally and randomly. They were 19 to 22. More female than male, and the nationalities were Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. All of these were students who were in the UK at the time. Okay. The research questions we were looking to answer were, to what extent does explicit instruction using dramatized literature improve participants' receptive knowledge of ellipsis? Is either of the treatments, either with input enhancement or with no enhancement, more effective than the other in developing receptive knowledge of ellipsis? And to what extent do participants themselves feel that the material that focus on ellipsis is useful to them? So that was the focus group data. Those were the questions we were trying to answer. So again, we were interested in receptive knowledge. We're not trying to work out or to measure here, did students improve their ability to use this spoken grammar feature? Okay, some results. These are the results from only the receptive test. The comprehension tests we did just to check whether that changed at all. They didn't change, and we didn't really expect it to change, and there was no significant differences in comprehension over time. So there's no data which is really worth discussing there. These are the pre, post, and delayed test scores. Experimental group 1, remember, they had the input enhancement as well. They were divided into groups of 17. So you can see some development, which is good. And you can see in the experimental groups that this was sustained to a degree over time into the delayed test, and the control group got worse over time. If you particularly compare pre to delayed test scores, there is a gain. We would expect some kind of drop off in the scores with a delay, but it was superior to the pre-test scores, which is positive. When we looked at the significance, there's significant gains. When we looked at the gain scores, particularly here, there were significant gains for experimental group 1 in comparison to the control group. Experimental group 2 were very near to significance in comparison to the control group. Again, a positive result. There were no significant differences between the two experimental groups. So, although the first group was significantly better than the control group over time, which is a positive result, the use of input enhancement did not, in this case, seem to be significantly better than no input enhancement. Okay, so positive result seems to show quite good evidence that this approach certainly worked. The focus groups, the views on the material in general, there's lots and lots of this data in the study, but this is just a brief snapshot, if you like. The views on the material in general were very positive from both experimental groups. They were very keen on Sherlock, and you can see that here. I think I love it that the way to use, these are not edited, by the way, or corrected, is really good to learn the British English, and especially listening, because it was so fast to speak. Another comment here on the fact that they speak very fast. It was very good because, like as she said it, he spoke very fast, and usually in our class the teacher speaks more slowly because we're studying English. Interesting that students pick up on these kind of things. So in general, they were very positive about the materials. In terms of the language awareness, this came out as well. This is evidence here of awareness of ellipsis. Yeah, but in daily life, British people, they just use short words, not long sentence. I just remember that. Of course, the student is not going to necessarily remember meta language such as ellipsis, but you can see there's evidence here of language awareness. Same thing here. Sherlock usually make his sentence shorter, and he usually say you or something. So it's useful for me in conversation with my flatmate. Okay, so there's some evidence here, and this was in the rest of this focus group data, that they did develop some awareness of language, and they could see to some extent how it was actually used outside of this drama as well. Obviously, they're in the UK and an English-speaking environment, so that's an advantage with this kind of study. Okay, so to summarize, dramatized literature and explicit instruction with textual enhancement and just explicit instruction can lead to significant gains in receptive knowledge of ellipsis over time. Okay, so that's a positive result. Textual enhancement was slightly superior in this case in terms of the, there's a significant, that group did significantly better in comparison to the control group. But when we compared the two types of teaching, there wasn't a significant difference. That's why I'm saying it was slightly superior. Focus group data seem to show that dramatized literature, okay, this is only an example, but potentially motivating as a model of spoken language. And it can help to develop spoken language awareness, which is what we were interested in. Okay, so in terms of the possible implications for teaching, one is that we would suggest it's worth taking a text-based approach. If you're going to use literary dialogues, take a text-based approach to literary dialogues. A text-based approach means choose texts which are first potentially interesting, engaging, etc. with your students. Then go back and look at the language that might be in them and what you might want to do with that language. And if you feel obviously there's nothing useful there, then you might have to choose something different. We think that that's probably much better than going to look for examples of very specific features. Try dramatized literature where available. We use Sherlock. There are many, many other series and things available on YouTube, etc., and many other formats. Use the examples to develop spoken language awareness, especially if the features that you might be interested in are not something we can easily teach students to produce. So it's difficult to get students to produce repetition because it's very much a discourse feature. You can point out that people repeat themselves an awful lot when they speak, but you can't really tell students when they need to do that. And ellipsis, of course, is learned in fixed expressions, which are already ellipted. So students might well pick up on things like want a coffee, etc. But other than that, it's quite difficult to teach them exactly when they might use it, because it is also a choice of speakers. Okay, so it can be very good to develop that just awareness.
Sorry, Chris, you have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, that's no problem. I've nearly finished. The other thing is to encourage, particularly if things are freely available, and many things are now, encourage extensive viewing outside of class time after things are being worked on. So very often students will do this for themselves. So one thing that came out of the focus groups was a student mentioned that after we'd done some classes focusing on bits of Sherlock, they went off onto YouTube or wherever they did it and watched lots of the episodes. So it was interesting for them. And I think that kind of extensive viewing, extensive listening is, there's a lot of evidence that extensive reading and listening is likely to be helpful for students, and that can be encouraged. I think the focus on these things in class time provides that kind of impetus and motivation. And we were very surprised with, given the age of these students, that none of them had actually watched Sherlock before, but they did know all about Sherlock Holmes. We were quite amazed about that. Okay, questions in a second. The references are here. This is in bold, this is the particular chapter of the book where this study is coming from, which came out in 2019. Some other references there. And as I mentioned before, if you want a copy of the slides, feel free to email me. I'll send you the PDF, and I'll also make it available to the Lit and Language Learning SIG. Okay, that's it from me. Very happy to take questions.
All right. Could I ask you to please stop share so that people can see you? And thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So now it's question time. We only have a couple of minutes, but Mr. Jones, if we go on for an extra 5 minutes, would you be okay with that?
That's fine by me. Yeah, no problem.
Great. So then we'll just have an extra 5 minutes for questions. Please feel free to press the raise hand button or raise your hand and unmute yourself. Or if you are more comfortable writing in the chat box, that's okay too.
I have a question, if that's all right.
Okay, Natalie.
Hi, Chris. I was just wondering can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can you turn up the volume just a touch, Natalie? Hi, Natalie.
Yeah. How did you find the particular instances of ellipsis, for example, in the Sherlock show? Did you specifically target Sherlock to find instances of this language, or was it just that you happened to be watching it and you thought, okay, there's a lot of this feature in there? How did you kind of find it? It sounds quite time consuming to find instances in a particular TV show or something.
Yeah, what we did was, yeah, it's a good question. What we did was we thought that Sherlock would be potentially interesting, etc., for these students. That was the first thing. Then we looked at particular. I think there was we found about 5 different kind of clips that we thought would be interesting for them potentially. One was when in the drama in one of the early series when Sherlock and Watson first meet, and they're in a taxi and they kind of start talking to each other properly. Then after that we looked at the language in them, and then we found one feature that happens a lot. I mean, it's possibly connected slightly to the style of Sherlock and this kind of speed of it. There was a lot of ellipsis in there. And there was also there was another episode which had a lot of request forms in it and modality, and there was another one which had the other feature that I mentioned. So that's the way we did it. We didn't go looking for ellipsis or whatever, but that was very much there when we had a look. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question there. Can you hear me okay, Chris?
Hi, Colin. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Good. Interesting presentation, Chris. Thanks for that. Listening to your presentation there, so good ideas there for input classes. So I was just thinking then for the next stage in terms of productive use, then suggestions for productive use of the features in classes, or studies then that look at productive use of those features. Do you have any follow-up studies or suggestions for that?
Well, I've done other studies on other aspects of productive features. So I can post a link to a study that we did on discourse markers a while ago now. But I think with some features like ellipsis, I think they are probably, I'm not sure, apart from in a limited way, how we could teach them for production really, because although we can teach students that people do this, and there are clear patterns to the way that they do it, it's a choice of speakers and not everybody will choose to do so. That's the first point. Second, because it's situational very often, it's difficult to tell students precisely when they might need to do this. So that's why we went for a kind of more receptive approach here. There are, though, I think, features that we could use, we could teach for productive purposes, such as I mentioned discourse markers, and vague language is another one. Yes, certainly. So I'm working on something at the moment which is connecting that stuff up together. So watch this space. But there is also I'll also put a link to another study in a second, hopefully.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Any more questions? We can handle one more. Madoka, please.
Sorry, it's not really a good question, but I was wondering, by the way, that was very interesting. I was wondering what's the, so you did a survey to assess the students' comprehension after this study.
Yeah.
So what other assessment did you do, or are you going to do, or no assessment? Like, because, so yeah, I just curious on what other, like, how to say that? Yeah, is there any way to know how much or to what degree students get it or didn't really get it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there were two tests that we used. We used the tests were we used different material. Obviously, we didn't test them directly on Sherlock because they'd already seen it. So we chose other material, and there was a straightforward comprehension questions. That was a test, and those didn't significantly differ between any of the groups at any stages, and we didn't really expect it to. But the second test was a receptive test of ellipsis based on the same material, and they had to spot where people had missed things out. So they were given a much fuller version of the text and told how many words were missing, and they had to notice what was actually missing. So that was the receptive ellipsis test, yeah, and that was those results, yeah, which was significant at the post-test and delay test stage, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's okay.
Thank you very much for your question, and thank you, Chris. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of this session. May I ask everybody for a round of applause for Chris? If you could unmute and please give him a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I've also put a handout in the chat there, and the study I mentioned. Sorry. I forget the full title, but 2014 we did a study on discourse markers. So that's more looking at production. If you Google, it's open access. I don't have the exact reference off the top of my head, but it's there.
Thank you, Chris, for that.
Okay.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.